Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to come here to speak at the first of many, hopefully, muscle mNIRS. And I would like to thank the organizers. I've already had a good time and learned quite a bit. So for me, it's been a great meeting so far, and I hope I can contribute. I really have two things I want to talk about. I have some of my opinions for a discussion point on how to interpret near-infrared measurements. And I've heard some things, and some of us are talking about the same topic, so that should be interesting, my thought through that. And then I'm going to talk about my pride and joy, what I think is the most amazing thing of all time, and that is to measure mitochondria using near-infrared light. So first of all, I have a little disclosure. I do have a small software company. Won't mention it too much. If you want to know, you can certainly talk to me, but otherwise, that's my disclosure. So here's who I was trained with. I like to mention this real quick. I was trained as a muscle physiologist by John Faulkner. I studied muscle contractile properties, made muscles contract, studied muscle fatigue. But I couldn't really study muscle fatigue, so to do that, I studied muscle energetics. I went and worked with Britton Chance at the University of Pennsylvania, little arm exercise miniature magnet, and then I worked with Jack Lee. What I loved about Jack Lee is he told me he didn't want me to do any experiment that involved more than 10 subjects. Once you did 10, move on to something else. So I love that guy. He was quite good. But I started doing near-infrared 1989 with Britton Chance and some of the older devices. So if you really want to know about the history of near-infrared spectroscopy, look up Marco Ferrari and his colleagues. They just published an article in Journal of Biomedical Optics on pulse oximetry. And he's been exchanging, if you know Marco, all caps, emails. It's great on the history. But I picked this one, Millikan, because, as mentioned, Britton Chance did his postdoc and worked with Millikan and took this technology along. But, and I thought this was the first real experiment for me. They're shining light into muscle and actually measuring the slope of deoxygenation and reoxygenation with different metabolic intensities and different blood flows. So it's kind of the first things. Now, his optical devices were pretty primitive, 600 to 700 for the deoxy and 7 to 800. So, but nonetheless, near-infrared has been around a long time. I think this is really where it started for me. Any of you seen this before? It's the Runman. You couldn't run with it, but it's the Runman, and I still have a couple of them, and they still work. Right? But the interesting thing about this is he sent this out all over the world, and people could not make it work. And so I'm not sure whether he advanced near-infrared spectroscopy or whether he put it back a few years. But for me, this is the kind of continuous wavelength portable device which I started using. And this is a review. I mean, you guys know this. You shine light in, maybe different detectors. And there's three things I think you can do with the device. You can measure oxygen levels. And you heard today already from the different manufacturers how one comes up with different oxygen levels. To me, I use it as a trend indicator. Oxygen's going up, oxygen going down. Simplifies it. But certainly one of the reasons why I want to point this out is there are a lot of devices, and actually now is a really spectacularly interesting time. The devices are getting better, more reliable, more dynamic, and therefore when you read papers, some of it's the old device, sometimes the new device. It'd be hard to tell what it's actually measuring, but you can measure oxygen levels. The other thing you do is measure blood flow, reactive hyperemia, lower oxygen with exercise or ischemia, and as an indicator dilution, how fast does the oxygenated signal return? So you can measure blood flow with this. And the third one is kind of what I like to do, which is measure oxygen levels, cut off the circulation. Theoretically, no oxygen comes in, no oxygen comes out, and that slope is proportional to metabolic rate. And that is the first step to measuring mitochondria. So you've heard about this, you shine light in, and one of the key things is getting past the skin and adipose tissue thickness, and you're going into superficial muscle. This person has a spinal cord injury, so there's a lot of fat in the muscle as well. And so one of the keys is, as we heard earlier, are you measuring tissue saturation, which is everything, or are you convinced that you're actually measuring the muscle oxygen levels as it goes? And again, the current devices are getting better, but they need to get better yet, I think. So penetration depth with adipose tissue thickness, you have about 1 centimeter of adipose tissue, your signal is knocked down quite a bit. Again, the devices can compensate by having farther separation distances and more light, but one of the things to consider is adipose tissue does influence the total signal. The author is here. I think that this is one of the most influential papers that has come out. Hopefully I don't butcher this too much. All the dots and whatever are different patient populations, and the goal was to separate the patient populations, but instead of separating patients, what you find is that adipose tissue explains. This is the oxygen slope, so oxygen consumption at rest. And so you're not measuring differences in patient populations, you're measuring differences in adipose tissue. Now this is old technology, but I do think because of this, people should measure adipose tissue thickness. I think we should measure skin color, and we should report both. And if you're using absolute values, you should show that this is not explaining your result. So that's why I show that. And then, now my next thing is, what is the oxygen level in muscle? And I have an experiment, and you would just use it as a discussion. If you pull these devices out, the value is 55 or 60, we saw earlier today, 70. Clearly the signal is coming from small vessels. Large vessels are like black holes, they absorb all the light, so you really only get differential absorption from smaller vessels, arteries, venules, arterioles, venules, and capillaries. But then in the capillary, there's a range of oxygen levels, varies on metabolic rate and blood flow. And there can be countercurrent exchange. So oxygen levels aren't somewhat complicated. But here's the experiment I'm going to talk about, which is, what do we think resting oxygen levels are? All right. And we do a physiological calibration. I'll kind of explain what is that really telling us. So here's the experiment. This is the oxygen signal, and this is the deoxygenating signal, and I think it's from a portamon. Inflate, you see a little slope. You electrically stimulate. The slope is much steeper, so you can increase metabolic rate. That's to verify the electrical stimulation works. Then you do a little electrical stimulation to increase muscle metabolism, and then cuff until you get to a level signal, whatever that is, and then electrically stimulate again. So in theory, if this is 0 oxygen level and you increase muscle metabolism, any remaining oxygen will be thus consumed. All right? And this is the oxy and deoxy signal, and I'll show that. So you do a stimulation check, and oxygen consumption at rest versus the exercise. So the stimulation works, and it increases both the deoxy and the oxy. So the stimulation does increase muscle metabolism. So again, stimulate, wait till it gets to 0, stimulate again. And what we found is there was no significant change either in the oxy or deoxy signal, suggesting that this is 0 available free oxygen. So if you do a physiological calibration, in theory, this is 0. And then we heard today from our Andre that maybe this is not 100%, but I've used that as an operational 100%. And that's how I would do a physiological range. So you can adjust oxygen levels, again, as a percent of the range. That's kind of what I've done. But it suggests that if you do a physiological calibration, you get 0. So now here's the next thing, myoglobin and hemoglobin. How much are we looking at? Theoretically, and this is based on some work by Barstow and one of his colleagues, most of the absorbing concentration is myoglobin in humans. This is rats. And what he has plotted is the concentration, but because hemoglobin has 4 binding sites, the actual binding might be 70% of the binding signal is myoglobin. Again, we can play with that, but that's a starting number. And then you would say at rest, what happens? Well, myoglobin is 100% oxygenated at rest, from what we know. So therefore, the signal is going to be 70 times or 100 times 0.7. And then you can try to make a calculation. What's hemoglobin? 100% in the artery, 40% in the vein. Maybe it's 70%. All right, just a rough guess. If you do that, resting oxygen in muscle should be 91%. Interesting. But if we do our measurement, resting oxygen levels, this is for the oxy signal, 0, we called it, and we're pretending that's 100. Well, for the oxygenated signal, it's 50 or 60. But for the deoxygenated signal, it's about 90%. Right? The signal is down about 90%. So 2 very different values. Why is that? Well, if you do a reperfusion and look at the signals, the oxy signal is a higher magnitude than the deoxy signal. There's an increase in blood volume. So what we are thinking is we assume that increasing blood volume is oxygenated heme because the muscle vasodilates and blood comes in and that's oxygenated blood. So to kind of summarize, if you look at the oxy-only signal, resting is 60. If you look at the deoxy signal, it's 90. If you do something like a TSI or SMO2, it's 50 to 60 or so. So one of the things we can talk about in this meeting is, do you guys think that 90 sounds reasonable? No. Or it really is 50, 60%? So anyway, that's my first thing as a discussion point, is what is resting muscle oxygen consumption? And so now you go to physiological calibration. Well, this is something I did a long time ago. Somebody with lean, somebody who has more fat, and the signals are not the same size. So maybe we should do this. Maybe I should have done this physiological calibration only with the deoxy signal. And again, we can talk about that. But my next point is measuring this slope and this slope. And I don't do that. I measure a T1/2. And we heard today that some people think they're different. But the reason I measure a T1/2 is because these 2 subjects will have very different slopes. But is it because their muscles are different, or is it because they're measuring both muscle and adipose tissue thickness? So I would make the argument that if you do the T1/2, it corrects for that adipose tissue thickness. And this is how I've measured it. I just show this because it's a sentimental slide for me. I like telling this story. I decided I was going to measure the half-time of recovery in patients with peripheral arterial disease. I've been testing myself. I go to test my first patient, who is Frank. And I put it on Frank's leg. He exercises for a minute, and then he recovers. And I was totally demoralized because that recovery curve in blue looks just like mine, and I don't have PAD. And then Frank told me that was his good leg, and I had a second chance. So I did him again, and that's the red, which is his bad leg. So my experiments in this field depended on Frank. He was a good guy. But this is recovery after exercise. And one of the things I want to point out is that this actually is a compound thing. It is post-exercise oxygen consumption, the oxygen consumption associated with resynthesis of phosphocreatine, and its blood flow. So this might have a T1/2 of 20 because it's both. All right. If you measure T1/2 of just ischemia, you can see the values are closer to 10 or 12. And young and old, about the same. But obviously, if somebody has poor circulation, they do really poorly. So now the question is T1/2 or the slope. And this is from Landers Ramos, who just got this paper published last week. So she looked at males and females and measured adipose tissue, and clearly the females have slightly more adipose tissue. But then she did a subset, which on mean had the same adipose tissue, finding, in this case, thinner females, and matched up. And then what did she see? Well, the initial slope of recovery was slower in females, but the half-time was the same. So the half-time was the same here. And then if you took the two groups that had the same adipose tissue, then their slopes were the same and their T1/2s were the same. So you could look at this and decide, do women have slower blood flow than men? Or is that just adipose tissue and they actually have the same blood flow? So that's kind of another one of my discussion points is, what do we measure? If you want to bait me, you can say slope 1 and slope 2, right? If you know what that is. But this is MVO2 or muscle metabolism, and this might be reactive hyperemia, which I would prefer to measure as a half-time of recovery. So that's my kind of discussions. And now I'm going to go on and tell you about my favorite measurement. I used to think my favorite measurement was measuring phosphocreatine levels in muscle every 4 seconds. I thought that was the most incredible thing. This might be better. So what I want to do is look at post-exercise oxygen consumption. So with this is going to be a measure of mitochondrial capacity, and let me kind of take you through that. Sorry, Jen. But it was based on phosphorus magnetic resonance. If you haven't seen this, you can cite phosphorus atoms, and you can see the various peaks, phosphocreatine in particular. ATP doesn't change very much. And if you exercise, you can deplete phosphocreatine, and then you stop, and you could measure what appears to be an exponential recovery of phosphocreatine. All right. And that has been shown. Ron Meyer was the first one that I know kind of showed that in the middle 80s. This is 1988, but the middle 80s, where he exercised rat muscle at different intensities, found an exponential curve that was the same rate constant. And he argued that you could measure this rate constants or these rate constants. Just easier to measure recovery rate constants. So offset kinetics is a way of measuring muscle metabolism. The other person I need to mention is Taka Hamanoka, because he actually came up with this for near-infrared spectroscopy. The interesting thing is we went to talks together. I invited him to give talks. I heard him give this talk over 10 years before I figured it out, what he was going through and what he was doing. So it took me a long time. But basically what both of them showed, both Ron and Taka, is that there is a good relationship between these phosphocreatine levels and oxygen consumption. So you can measure the recovery of phosphocreatine kinetics in a $4 million US magnet, or you can measure the recovery of oxygen, $1,500 optical device. I chose $1,500. All right, so here's some of the early data. This is just something, I guess, and again, electrically stimulate, measure these slopes, plot them, you get kind of an exponential curve. The results kind of work. But you look here, according to this, the muscle's producing oxygen. That's not possible. So therefore, there's a problem. And I looked at Taka's data with a microscope, and his data looked the same. So what we found is you inflate a cuff, and the oxygen signal goes up. The oxy signal goes up as it should, but the oxy signal is not coming down. There's a change in blood volume. So we decided that this need to be corrected for. We're not measuring scattering. Barstow said he did these experiments with phase modulated devices and didn't see it. So this is something in the continuous wavelength devices. So we corrected for this. We called it our blood volume correction. And if you corrected for that oxygen saturation, then these two slopes were the same. And if they're the same, then we thought, we are measuring, the slope really reflects oxygen consumption. And we have corrected out any other problem. So here is this measurement, my mitochondrial measurement. You need three things. You need to measure oxygen levels. Again, I don't think it matters which kind, anything that gives you a reliable oxygen measurement. You need to inflate a cuff to cut off the circulation so you can measure metabolism, and then you need to increase metabolism and then repeatedly measure the recovery. So stimulate a series of these slopes. If you blow them up, deoxy's going up, oxy's going down. And these slopes here are actually this right here, which is interesting. It's a very nice looking exponential curve. And there's me standing in front of the two people who did all the work, right? So they made me do that. So here's an example of an experiment. 20 minutes or so. Resting oxygen consumption, make sure the device works. Electrically stimulate or voluntary exercise, measure 20 or 22 such slopes. Repeat it, so you have two measurements to try to say, well, we're close to getting what we are. If we did an ischemic calibration, like I said, I'm going to call that 0. And I'm going to say that these oxygen levels are high enough so that my slope measurement shouldn't be impaired, right? And off we go. Here's an example of what not to do. It's actually real data. You get artifacts. Here you elect, this is kind of an ischemic calibration. You exercise them so that the oxygen levels are near 0. If you do that, well then when you inflate the cuff, there's no consumption of oxygen because there isn't any left. And you can see the slopes are small and get bigger. So movement or noise, inadequate exercise, oxygen levels fall too low. So there is some kind of art to making these measurements. But here's some of the validation. So that's my theory. How well does this work? You guys saw this a week ago, so there you go. But if we did simultaneous measurements, the yellow is the infrared measurements and the red is the phosphocreatine measurements. They track. And if you plot them, magnetic resonance rate constant, or in this case time constant, and the near infrared time constant, they track. So they appear, you can study the change in the phosphorus or you can study the change in oxygen, appear to go together. And I also didn't say there has been some where we have compared this measurement to biopsy measurements of mitochondria, and they also agree. So how do we find this useful? Well, here's an example. We studied people with MS of various capabilities. They had to at least walk. And if we measured our oxidative capacity rate constant with their 6-minute walk time, we actually see a pretty nice relationship. All right. We also did it with my muscle endurance test, which I won't talk about. This cost $10,000. This cost $200,000. I'm excited about that one too, all right, in terms of its correlation. But it does look like, this is in the calf of people with multiple sclerosis, so it does look like it does track with what you might expect. It also appears to be somewhat reproducible. We can get a coefficient of variation of 8 to 12% in control subjects. Clearly, if you're testing some patient, it could be more difficult, but you can get good reproducibility, but you need beautiful curves. The next thing is, why do I like the recovery kinetics? When I first heard of this, I just got really excited because I used to exercise my patients and my controls and try to match their strength and try to match the work level to strength. It was very complicated. Turns out with this recovery kinetics, as long as it's exponential, it works. So we can electrically stimulate at different rates, and as long as there is enough, you notice this value is a little higher compared to these. As long as you get enough depletion, you get the same rate constant. And we've also compared voluntary exercise to electrical stimulation exercise, get the same value. So the nice thing about this test is you can exercise, you can electrically stimulate, you don't have to control for the intensity, as long as you get enough activation, and you get a recovery curve that seems to be consistent, and it works. So our next thing, does it give the expected results? So in my career, I've done about 3 athlete studies, and here's one of them. So we tested semi-professional cyclists. Some of them were making money and some of them wanted to make money. They were quite good. And an example is, in red is a control person and in blue is one of these cyclists, and this is on the quadriceps. And you could see the blue looks a little bit faster. Right? That's our results here, the controls, the cyclists. But the difference between the controls and cyclists were very similar to the difference that we found in professional runners versus professional elite runners versus controls in the calf. So very similar and not too different than biopsy studies. So this seems to be, geez, you could study athletes. Right? And then, of course, I was more interested in patient populations. So the guy you saw in my first picture and the control subjects, so the people with motor complete spinal cord injuries, their muscles have been paralyzed for 9 years on average, recover a lot slower. And so here, patients with spinal cord injury versus controls, and again, the magnitude of difference is just about the same as phosphocreatine recovery kinetics measured in a similar population, and similar to what has been done with succinate dehydrogenase from muscle biopsies. So these are our first 2 experiments, and they kind of suggest, you know what, we get the results we expect in terms of patient groups. But if you're studying muscles, you want to exercise them. So this is one of a couple of exercise studies we did. We did wrist curls for 30 minutes a day, 5 days a week for a month. We increased the intensity every week. I did this, you could fry an egg on my forearm when I trained. It was pretty intense. And we went up every week, and we measured mitochondria every week, and you can see that the mitochondrial function went up about 60%, which is about what you'd read in the literature. And when we stopped training, the values came back down. And the T1/2 of mitochondrial adaptation for us was just under 8 days. And if you read the literature, mitochondria should adapt with a T1/2 of about 7 days. So that rate of adaptation, de-adaptation in this case, is what you'd expect in the literature. The nice thing about this, I don't know if any of you are biopsy fans, but 9 measurements in 2 months. If you're doing biopsies, I'm not volunteering for that one, right? So the advantage of this mitochondrial assessment is you could probably do 3 times a day if you wanted to, right? It's a fairly robust type measurement. So, I'm going pretty fast too, by the way. So this is kind of a compendium of my life's work. We're studying about every patient you could possibly test. So we did a couple of endurance training groups. Those endurance athletes that I told you. We also did the little fingers of piano players. How about that? They were also considerably elevated over the little fingers of everybody else, but the texting finger was the same in piano players and controls. How about that? But we've done a number of metabolic. We did people with type 1 diabetes who are well controlled, a number of neurological groups, from Parkinson's, Friedreich's ataxia, MS, ALS, cystic fibrosis, spinal cord injury. So we can test just about every patient population you can find. We also did people with heart failure and peripheral arterial disease. It's quite interesting doing peripheral arterial disease because you need to increase muscle metabolism without lowering oxygen. Think about that, but you can do it. So the nice thing about this is this measurement has a continuous scale, right? From the lowest people that seem to be alive to the highest people, and you can test everyone in between. What I didn't show is you can test any muscle you can put a cuff above. So forearm, bicep, tricep, quads, hamstrings, calf, tibialis anterior. So you can do leg and arm muscles. And in patient populations, I like doing both the arm and the leg because I call the arm the activity independent. Most patients do, and controls don't use their arms. So if you want to know if a disease affects somebody, test their arms. If you test their legs, then you have both their activity levels and whatever's happening to them going on. So the other compendium is our training studies, and we've done a number of training studies. We trained the controls, which I showed you. We did endurance training of spinal cord injury. That means they wore electrical stimulators every day for 4 months. We also did resistance training where they trained with 80 muscle contractions a week, and they still saw a small increase in mitochondria. We did a lower motor neuron injury, which he had no mitochondria at baseline. But after a year and a half of training, he actually had mitochondria. And we've trained people with multiple sclerosis. This is with body weight support treadmill training. Showed an increase in their mitochondria. We showed that people with peripheral arterial disease can increase their mitochondria without any change in their blood flow because the calcified block isn't going away, but their increased walking distance is probably associated with their increase in mitochondria. So that's an example. And we tested people with heart failure. I didn't show you that result, but they didn't improve. Now they were taking statins, high-dose statins. And as you know, high-dose statins may well inhibit mitochondrial plasticity. So again, this is a training study you can test and train. So what have we done since then? This is just a small thing. I think I was presenting at the Britain Chance meeting, the last one, not this one. And I showed this result, and some guy stuck his hand up and said, God, you're making all these measurements and nothing is happening. So we changed our protocol. Why do cuff inflations and deflations and measure all these if the signal's not really changing? So our current approach is to do 4 interweaved incomplete recovery curves. So we'll do 6 slopes and then compare it to the final value. So that way, in the 20 minutes, we get 2 tests, and in 12 minutes, we get 4 tests. So we actually get twice the data with about half the cuff inflation. So we've really tried to improve that. In general, the 2 methods give you the same result. That's all they're saying is the 6 cuff thing and the 22 cuff thing pretty much give the same result. And we did biceps and forearm with this. So here's the last thing. What if you can make 4 interweaved measurements? You can make 4 mitochondrial measurements before, and then we did a minute of strenuous exercise and found that our mitochondrial assessments actually declined and temporarily improved. So it's quite possible that intense strenuous exercise might have a transient impairment of mitochondria, maybe related to hydrogen ion. We'll need to kind of go into that. But if you can do these repeated interweave measurements, you might actually be able to do time course measurements of mitochondria. Try doing this with a biopsy, right? So I think that there's some real interesting things to be done. So to summarize, long day, here we are, is I think continuous wavelength devices were, and to many extents still are, influenced by skin color and ATT. So I would love to see studies document that their measurements are not influenced by this when you publish, right? So I think that this is an important conclusion. People should make sure their devices, now the devices we saw today were pretty exciting and are really getting close to this, but I think they still need to document it. The next thing is I'm still a fan of this physiological calibration, but I think resting measurements might be closer to 90 than 50 or 60, based on both what Barstow seems to think is going on and as well as our measurements. And I think measuring a half time of recovery of oxygen is a better way of measuring flow, but again, it's my opinion. And I'm also, as you know, a total fan of this mitochondrial assessment. I really think this is something that we should do more of moving forward in the future, right? There's my lab, and plenty of time for questions, hopefully.